How can art best serve both creator and viewer in terms of embodying protective and healing power at this time? Well, at all times, not just this time, I understand why question is positioned this way, but it's at all times. All art, or all noble purpose of art, is to bring forth that what is hidden. The true, by definition, a true work of art is an act of transmutation of gross elements into pure gold of experience. Let me elaborate on that a little bit before going back to the maybe more specific aspect of this question, and maybe I'll illustrate it by some story. Art is a French term, and it's not that old. If we go back into the history, a little bit further history, let's say beyond Renaissance, beyond the 13th to 16th century, which is considered to be the time when Renaissance really swept across Europe, across the Western world, what was considered by the term art and what it became is not one and the same. And with time, when art kind of gained that, if you will, status as a just a facet aspect of human activity, and that slogan, art for the art's sake, which Picasso gave his gloss, why not, set in motion, or rather solidified that understanding that somehow art is just a peripheral activity, at times selfish, very often more than not, in terms of how the art world, or the art market in this case, views this. But that's a very narrow definition of what art really means here. I prefer to see art in terms of transformation, and all art is dealing with raw matter, whether this is in relation to material that visual artist uses, whether this is in relation to sounds that composer operates with, whether these are words that writer or a poet has at their capacity, whether this is bodily movement when it comes to dance forms, facial expressions, and so forth. Actor in terms of the range of emotional potential that is available to convey convincingly certain psychological states. All this is a raw matter, and it will remain raw until it has the possibility to be transmuted into something, and that something becomes the work of art. It's literally a new element is being born out of the transmutation, or rather purification, of the elements. When we take paint and squeeze it onto our palette, let's say that more the old-fashioned way of speaking of painting, and we have just paint, cobalt blue, cadmium, red, we have this ivory black, we have this, whatever paint we have there, right? Cinnabar, zinc white. These are just paints from the shop, from the factory. They're gross, as it were. They need to go into a process of mixing. They need to undergo this process where is through skillful handling something else takes place. And that skillful handling gives rise to a form, certain form, wherever, on a canvas, on a board, on a wall, on a floor, on a ceiling, made in marble, sandstone, clay, sand. It doesn't matter. Whatever that material is, it's a raw matter which undergoes this transformation, which is not short of transmutation as an alchemical reaction, alchemical process, where it gives rise to something else, gives birth to something else altogether. And that is the healing power of art. Pay attention, please. Not even in terms of what and how it will end up looking, although some works of art have withstood the test of time to such degree that one only marvels what an amount of power, that cosmic power, that Shakti, went into their creation. But we're speaking about here the underlying process of creating a work of art, which in itself has that noble purpose of transmutation of the forces. Transmutation of the elements, I meant. Not unlike in Tantra, where there are rituals aimed at purifying the elements so as to give rise to another reality. And that's what's the noble purpose of art. How it manifests in magnificent buildings, operas, concertos, or essays, novels, paintings, installations, poems, is another matter. So in other words, how it manifests in whatever form, as magnificent cathedrals and what we just mentioned before, has this formal aspect. And this is where different cultures, Western culture, took at some point the emphasis on preservation of the artifact. Perhaps architecture is not the best example, because architecture meant to serve and has this permanence about it, because after all, it's made out of stone. It's, as it were, set in stone, so it's there to last. But when we speak about a lot of other approaches in creating works of art, it was not always in terms of how it will end up as an artifact. Not to give a critical or comparative analysis, but it's interesting that in this respect, let's say something as unusual as creation of mandalas in Buddhism, where the creation of the mandala is not the end result of preserving that mandala for posterity or for others to look at it once it has been constructed, once it has been built. And we know very well that it takes a lot of painstaking attention to build these mandalas according to the very strict rules of how these mandalas are constructed. And yet, we also know very well that upon the construction of this mandala, that mandala is being given back to nature. In other words, it's being smudged, destroyed, and only in some very funny cases when these mandalas were given to other cultures as an act of gift, then somehow cultural misunderstanding entered. And like, for example, the mandala that was made here in Mallorca by the community of Dalai Lama has been preserved under glass. And I've seen some other mandalas in California, which traditionally speaking were meant to be given back to nature, destroyed, as that sandcastle built at the shore to enjoy it, but then the waves will claim it back. I'm giving this an example here to underscore or underline that it is the building, the act of creation here that matters most, not what will survive or will be preserved after. Interesting, very interesting. So was the Vedic approach in ancient times. Vedic people never built altars to last. They will build an altar, perform the ritual, and then the altar will be consumed, literally, by that fire for which that whole altar was built. So in other words, no traces left of that culture. This is what makes it so enigmatic. All the power went into the word instead. All the power went into the hymns, into reverberations, into the power of vibration. Everything, all creativity, it's like as if Vedic people decided that what's worth preserving was vibrations, sound. Hence, Rig Veda was composed over perhaps hundreds of years as that collective composition of many seers of reality, adding to it from the higher levels of consciousness to compose this monument to Shakti, monument to the mother of creation, which Rig Veda is known for. But going back to your question now more specifically, how can art best serve both creator and viewer? As long as you have your intentions clearly set, I wouldn't even worry about how, because otherwise we open up the territory for the mind to enter and begin to interpret, speculate, calculate, calibrate. Let the mind work here purely in terms of this, if you will, automated machinery of supporting the process. Like every creative being knows, once certain skills and certain tools are learned how to handle, it becomes really secondary to the process of creativity. The beginner struggles with the matter of the material because something needs to be still brought to the greater degree of handling, whether the hands, how they press the notes on this or that string instrument, or how the hands touch the keys and notes on the keyboard, or how the hand gesture really allows one to express oneself fully through that drawing, through that brush stroke. But once this is one second nature, it falls on the background. It's no longer principle. It's no longer important. Therefore, I wouldn't worry how best one can serve here as long as one's intention is set. One's intention is clearly there. And if maybe, I don't know if it could be added here just as an invitation, encouragement to all those who find it difficult in these times to create because of the sheer scale of what we're going through as a humanity. Not just with this particular calamity of the pandemic, but overall. I want to just give this short example from my own life. It's just happened when I was working on my show of drawings and pastels back in 2001, in the summer of 2001. When it came to closer to the culmination of that, 9/11 happened. And I was hearing the news of that on the Radio 3 as I was working in my then London studio. And it was literally the reality and what was happening out there. And it's like all kind of collapsed. And people of my generation who remember this, who lived through this, all remember where they were in that moment in time. Of course, I was knocked off of my usual kind of going about, working in the studio, because suddenly it felt like, what's the purpose of it all? I'm doing these drawings, in a corner of this London. Who cares about it? the world is like completely showing the signs of going mad. There is something really going on in unseen proportions, unseen before, at least to myself, to those I knew. So it was very discouraging. I was in my mid-30s. And it just happened that reaching out to some of the people I knew in New York, one of them, or rather one family that I knew, they're good friends, and the man, Jonathan Kagan, was a patron of mine. He was among the group of people who were supporting what I was doing, and married to a dear friend of mine also, whom I knew for many, many years. So we had this casual conversation, and I decided to voice my hesitations. And I said, like, what's the point? Why am I even preparing for this exhibition, for this show? Who's going to come? Who's going to, let alone buy? Why am I doing this? And this man, who is a very successful financier, and by the way, very well known in the art world in terms of his dedication. He is the patron and the benefactor of 3 major museums in the United States, including Metropolitan and the Boston Museum of Fine Art. And he's also supporting the British Museum in England. And he's one of the renowned coin collectors, antique coin collectors. So it's like he just gives me this almost cynical response. He says, you know what, Igor? There's nothing more comforting to spend money on art, even if the end of the world is tomorrow. And of course, it seems so kind of insensitive. And at the same time, the deep underlying meaning of that was that even if the world is about to end tomorrow, this sensitivity to art, to beauty, is this what makes us humans? This what uplifts us, takes us above any circumstances. This is what makes everything worthwhile. It's just like sonatas and concerts were played even in the occupied cities during the Second World War. Who cares for this, right? One could say. And that is the power of art. And I feel like sharing this to all the artists out there, that art is always needed, not because it's needed as a certain product to consume, although artists need to live, therefore, of course, there are economics behind it. But art is rather something we cannot live without, and that answers everything. And that's what makes art indispensable, irrespective of what time we go through. That's what makes art true art, which has this right incentive at the core behind the process of creation, healing, because it reconciles something here. So of course, that served as a great boost to going back to, without any hesitation. And this was, by the way, the end of my affair with the creating works of art, because as some of you may know or have heard, the transformation of consciousness was to follow. And that same year, I left art because something else was there in consciousness to unfold and for me to experience. But I thought to mention this simply as that, if you will, additional response.